The camera lens was no bigger than a pinhead, but it felt like the weight of the world in Denise Patterson's trembling hands. She pressed it into the corner of the living room bookshelf, her heart hammering so hard she was sure Robert would hear it upstairs. The tiny device disappeared perfectly behind her grandmother's old photo frame, the one with the cracked glass she'd been meaning to fix for months. She stepped back, wiping sweat from her palms despite the October chill seeping through their Chicago home's windows. What was she doing? This wasn't her. Denise Patterson didn't spy on people. She protected them. As a cybersecurity specialist for a major bank, she spent her days building walls against invasions of privacy, not orchestrating them. But here she was at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, installing her third hidden camera in 2 days. The first one had gone up in the kitchen yesterday, tucked behind the coffee maker after she'd watched Robert's entire demeanor change during a phone call. He'd stepped outside to take it, something he'd never done before. When he came back in, his hands were shaking and his smile looked forced. He kissed her forehead and mumbled something about work stress, but his eyes wouldn't meet hers. The second camera had been easier to install in their bedroom, hidden in the charging station on his nightstand. She told herself she was being paranoid, that 8 years of marriage should count for something. But the way he'd been coming to bed later and later, the way he'd started password protecting his phone after years of leaving it open on the counter, these weren't imaginary red flags. Now, standing in their darkened living room where their 8-year-old daughter Grace had built a blanket fort just hours earlier, Denise felt like she was betraying everything she'd built with Robert. Their family photos smiled down at her from every surface. Their wedding day at her mother's church, Grace's first steps in this very room, last Christmas morning when they'd all worn matching pajamas and laughed until their sides hurt. But something was wrong. She could feel it in the way Robert's laugh had become hollow, in how he'd started volunteer tutoring sessions that ran impossibly late, in the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder unexpectedly. The floorboard creaked upstairs and Denise froze. Robert's footsteps moved across their bedroom floor, probably just going to the bathroom. She held her breath until she heard the bathroom door close, then quickly finished positioning the camera. Her laptop bag sat on the kitchen counter, loaded with the wireless receiver that would let her monitor all 3 feeds from her office downtown. She hadn't planned this. 3 weeks ago, she'd ordered the cameras for a client's home security consultation. When the package arrived at their house instead of her office, she tossed it in her bag, planning to take it to work the next day. But then came Robert's first strange phone call, and the package had sat there like a loaded gun, whispering possibilities she didn't want to consider. As she crept back upstairs, Denise caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. Her dark skin looked ashen in the moonlight, and her usually bright eyes were shadowed with something she didn't recognize. When had she become this person? When had love turned into suspicion? She slipped back into bed beside Robert, who was lying on his side facing away from her. His breathing was steady but not quite deep enough for real sleep. She studied the back of his neck, the place where his close-cropped hair met skin she'd kissed 1,000 times. He smelled like the lavender soap Grace had picked out for him at the farmer's market, mixed with the familiar scent of the chalk dust that always clung to his clothes. This was her husband. The man who still made her coffee every morning exactly the way she liked it. Who had held her hand through her father's funeral 2 years ago and never once complained about her family's drama. Who read bedtime stories to Grace in different voices until their daughter dissolved into giggles. But it was also the man who had started deleting his text messages and clearing his browser history. Who had developed sudden interests in evening activities that didn't include her. Who had stopped reaching for her in the middle of the night, something he'd done unconsciously for their entire marriage. Tomorrow she would go to work and open her laptop and see whatever there was to see. The cameras would either confirm her worst fears or prove that grief and stress were making her paranoid. Either way, she'd have answers. What she didn't expect was that those answers would change everything she thought she knew about the man sleeping beside her. As dawn crept through their bedroom curtains, Denise finally drifted off to sleep, one hand resting on Robert's shoulder and the other clutching her phone like a lifeline. In 8 hours she would be sitting in her office watching a live feed of her empty living room, wondering if she'd made the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea that by the end of the week, those cameras would reveal a truth so unexpected, so heartbreaking, and ultimately so beautiful that it would restore her faith not just in Robert, but in the very idea that love could survive anything. But first she had to survive tomorrow. Denise's coffee went cold as she stared at her laptop screen, watching her empty living room like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. Her office door was closed, her phone was on silent, and she told her assistant she wasn't to be disturbed unless the building was on fire. The 3 camera feeds were arranged in neat windows across her monitor. living room, kitchen, bedroom. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. At 8:15 a.m., Robert had kissed Grace goodbye at the front door, his teacher bag slung over his shoulder and his travel mug in hand. Normal. At 8:23 a.m., Grace had grabbed her backpack and headed out to catch the school bus. Also normal. The house had been empty ever since, and Denise was starting to feel like the worst person alive. Her phone buzzed with a text from Camille. Coffee later? You sounded weird yesterday. Camille Thompson had been her best friend since nursing school, back when Denise was still figuring out she belonged in tech instead of healthcare. They'd stayed close through career changes, marriages, divorces. Camille's, thankfully, not hers, in the general chaos of adult life. If anyone would understand what she was going through, it would be Camille. But how could she explain this? Hey girl, I'm spying on my husband because he's been acting suspicious? Even thinking it made her stomach twist. She typed back, can't today. Swamped with work. It wasn't entirely a lie. Her desk was covered with security protocols that needed updating, and her inbox had 47 unread emails. But she couldn't concentrate on anything except the 3 empty rooms on her screen. At 11:30 a.m. something finally happened. Robert appeared in the kitchen feed, moving quickly toward the refrigerator. Denise sat up straighter, her heart rate picking up. He was supposed to be at school. Lincoln Middle School was 40 minutes away, and lunch period didn't start until noon. She watched him grab a bottle of water and lean against the counter, checking his phone. His body language was tense, almost nervous. He kept looking toward the front windows like he was expecting someone. Then he was gone again, disappearing through the front door so quickly that Denise barely had time to process what she'd seen. She rewound the feed, watching it again in slow motion. Robert's face had been tight with worry, and his hands had been shaking slightly as he checked his phone. The rational part of her brain offered innocent explanations. Maybe he'd forgotten something for class. Maybe he was feeling sick and had come home during his prep period. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for everything, and she was destroying her marriage over nothing. But the tightness in her chest suggested otherwise. Her work phone rang, startling her so badly that she nearly knocked over her water bottle. The caller ID showed it was Janet from HR, probably calling about the quarterly security training she was supposed to schedule. Denise Patterson, she answered, trying to sound professional and not like someone who was having a nervous breakdown. Hi Denise, sorry to bother you. I just had the strangest call. Someone from Lincoln Middle School called asking if you'd requested personal references for your husband. They said they needed to verify his employment for some kind of application. The words hit Denise like ice water. What kind of application? They wouldn't say. The woman I talked to seemed surprised that I didn't know about it. She said Robert had listed you as his emergency contact and me as a professional reference. I told her I'd never met your husband and that she should probably call you directly. Denise's mouth felt like cotton. Did she leave a number? She said she'd call back. Honestly, it seemed a little strange. Usually those kinds of calls go through official channels. Are you guys applying for something that would require employment verification? No. Not that I know of. Denise struggled to keep her voice steady. Thanks for letting me know, Janet. If she calls back, can you get her information and have her contact me directly? Of course. Everything okay? Yeah, just miscommunication probably. Thanks again. Denise hung up and immediately called Robert's cell phone. It went straight to voicemail, which wasn't unusual during school hours, but today it felt ominous. She tried the main office at Lincoln Middle School. Lincoln Middle School, this is Patricia. Hi, I'm trying to reach Robert Patterson. He's a 6th grade teacher there. Oh, I'm sorry. Mr. Patterson called in sick today. Can I take a message? The world tilted slightly. Sick? Are you sure? Yes, he called first thing this morning. Said he had the flu. Is this an emergency? I could try to reach him. No emergency. I'm his wife. I must have misunderstood. Thank you. Denise hung up with shaking hands. Robert had lied to her. He'd gotten dressed for work, kissed them both goodbye, and then called in sick. He'd come home briefly, looking nervous and checking his phone, and now someone was calling about employment verification for an application she knew nothing about. She looked back at her laptop screen. The house was empty again, but somehow it felt different now. The familiar rooms looked foreign, like she was seeing them through a stranger's eyes. The living room where Grace practiced piano every afternoon. The kitchen where Robert made pancakes every Saturday morning. The bedroom where they'd whispered their dreams to each other in the dark. What was happening to her life? Her hands hovered over the keyboard, torn between calling Robert again and doing something that would cross a line she couldn't uncross. She could access their phone records through their family account. She could check their credit card statements, their bank transactions, their browsing history. Her job had taught her exactly how to find digital footprints, how to track someone's movements through the data they left behind. But that would make her no better than the people her security systems were designed to stop. Her laptop chimed with a motion alert from the kitchen camera. Robert was back, and this time he wasn't alone. Denise leaned forward, squinting at the grainy feed. A woman was with him, tall, elegant, with natural hair styled in a way that suggested she'd spent time and money at a salon. She was wearing a business suit and carrying a leather portfolio, and she was standing much too close to Robert as they talked. The woman handed Robert some papers and he signed them quickly, his movements sharp with anxiety. They spoke for a few more minutes, too far from the camera's microphone for Denise to hear anything, and then the woman left through the front door. Robert stood in the kitchen for a long time after she left, staring down at whatever papers remained in his hands. His shoulders were slumped like he was carrying the weight of the world, and when he finally looked up, Denise could see exhaustion written across his face even through the low-resolution feed. Then he did something that made Denise's blood run cold. He opened the kitchen drawer where they kept important papers, insurance documents, birth certificates, their marriage license, and filed whatever the woman had given him right alongside their most precious documents. As he left the house again, Denise was already grabbing her keys. Whatever was in that drawer, she was going to find out today. Denise's hands shook as she pulled into her own driveway at 2:15 p.m. She'd left work claiming a family emergency, which wasn't technically a lie. Her marriage might very well be having an emergency right now. Grace wouldn't be home from school for another hour, and Robert's car wasn't in the driveway. She had maybe 30 minutes to find out what was in that drawer before she had to become a mother and wife again, pretending everything was normal. The house felt different when she stepped inside. Not physically, everything was exactly where it should be. Grace's art supplies were still scattered across the dining room table from last night's homework project. Robert's coffee mug was still in the sink from this morning. But knowing that cameras were watching her every move in her own home made her feel like an intruder. She went straight to the kitchen drawer, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The drawer stuck slightly, the way it always did, and she had to jiggle it just right to get it open. Under the insurance papers and behind Grace's immunization records, she found a manila folder that hadn't been there 3 days ago. Inside were medical documents. Pages and pages of them, with letterhead from Chicago General Hospital's oncology department. The word oncology hit her like a physical blow. Cancer. Someone had cancer. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely read the papers, but Robert's name was at the top of every page. Patient, Robert James Patterson. Date of birth, March 15, 1988. Diagnosis, Stage 2 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The folder slipped from her hands, papers scattering across the kitchen floor. Stage 2. Cancer. Her husband had cancer and he hadn't told her. She sank down onto the kitchen tiles, gathering the papers with trembling fingers. There were test results dating back 6 weeks. Treatment recommendations. A surgical consultation report. Financial assistance applications that explained the employment verification call. And there, at the bottom of the pile, was a business card for Dr. Sarah Martinez, oncology social worker, with a handwritten note on the back. Robert, remember what we discussed about telling your family. The sooner the better. You don't have to carry this alone. So, Dr. Martinez. The well-dressed woman who had been in her kitchen 2 hours ago wasn't some mistress or business partner. She was Robert's social worker, helping him navigate a cancer diagnosis that he'd been hiding for over a month. Denise sat on her kitchen floor, surrounded by evidence of her husband's suffering, and sobbed like her heart was breaking. Because it was. Not from betrayal, but from the realization that Robert had been carrying this terror alone while she'd been suspicious of his every move. The late nights made sense now. The password on his phone. The deleted texts and cleared browser history. He'd been researching treatments, reading survival statistics, probably joining support groups and trying to figure out how to tell his wife and daughter that their world was about to change forever. She thought about all the times in the past month when she'd found him staring off into space, and she'd assumed he was bored or distant. He'd been processing a cancer diagnosis. She thought about the way he'd been holding Grace a little longer during their bedtime routine, and she'd worried he was being overly sentimental. He'd been memorizing moments in case they were numbered. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert. Hey baby, feeling better? Picking up Grace from school and taking her for ice cream. Home by 4:30. Love you. He was trying to be normal for Grace's sake. trying to give their daughter a regular Tuesday afternoon while his world was falling apart. Denise carefully returned all the papers to the folder and put it back exactly where she'd found it. Then she sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they'd eaten breakfast this morning, where Grace had practiced spelling words last night, where they'd planned their Thanksgiving menu just last weekend and tried to figure out what to do with this information. She couldn't let on that she knew. Not yet. Robert would have to tell her himself, in his own time, in his own way. But knowing what she knew now, she could see everything differently. The stress in his shoulders wasn't guilt, it was fear. The distance he'd been putting between them wasn't emotional, it was protective. He wasn't pulling away because he loved her less. He was pulling away because he loved her too much to burden her with this before he had to. But what about the cameras? She'd been watching him, recording him, violating his privacy during the most vulnerable period of his life. The knowledge sat in her stomach like a stone. She pulled out her laptop and quickly disabled all 3 cameras, deleting the software and clearing the recording files. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be spying on her husband anymore. He deserved better than that. He deserved a wife who trusted him, especially when he was trying to protect her. At 4:25 p.m., she heard Grace's laughter in the driveway, followed by Robert's deeper chuckle. They were talking about something that had happened at school, their voices mixing in the easy rhythm of a father and daughter who adored each other. Denise went to the front window and watched them walk up the sidewalk together. Grace was skipping, her backpack bouncing, a chocolate ice cream stain on her school uniform. Robert was listening intently to whatever story she was telling, his face animated in a way that hid whatever fear he was carrying. When they came through the front door, Robert kissed Denise's cheek like he did every day. But today she noticed how thin he'd gotten, how his hug lasted just a moment longer than usual. "How was your day, baby?" he asked, and his voice carried genuine concern. Even while dealing with cancer, he was worried about her day. "Good," she lied, the same way he'd been lying to protect her. "How are you feeling? You said you were sick this morning." Something flickered across his face, guilt, maybe, or fear that she was seeing through his carefully constructed normalcy. "Better now. Just needed some rest." Grace ran upstairs to change out of her school clothes, and for a moment, Denise and Robert stood alone in their kitchen. The same kitchen where she'd watched him through a hidden camera just hours ago. The same kitchen where he'd met with his social worker to discuss treatment options. The same kitchen where he'd been carrying the weight of a cancer diagnosis while she'd been questioning his fidelity. "Robert," she started, not sure what she was going to say. He looked at her expectantly, and she could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. The bone-deep tiredness of someone who was fighting a battle no one else knew about. "I love you," she said finally. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that." His face crumpled slightly just for a second before he composed himself. "I love you too, Denise. More than you know." That night, she lay awake listening to him breathe beside her, wondering how many nights she had left to take that sound for granted. Tomorrow, she would find a way to let him know that he didn't have to carry this alone. That whatever came next, they would face it together. But tonight, she just listened to him breathe and tried not to think about all the things she should have noticed if she'd been paying attention to her husband instead of being suspicious of him. 3 days passed before Denise couldn't stand it anymore. 3 days of watching Robert pretend everything was normal while dark circles deepened under his eyes and his appetite disappeared. 3 days of Grace chattering about school and weekend plans while her father smiled and nodded and looked like he was memorizing every word. On Friday evening, after Grace was asleep, Denise found Robert in their basement home office, staring at his laptop screen with an expression of quiet desperation. She could see the glow of the Chicago General Hospital website reflected in his glasses. "Robert," she said softly, and he startled so violently that he nearly knocked over his coffee mug. "Hey baby, I was just, work stuff." He quickly closed the laptop, but not before Denise caught a glimpse of a page titled, "What to Expect During Chemotherapy." Her heart broke all over again. She moved into the room and closed the door behind her, then turned to face her husband, the man who had been fighting the biggest battle of his life in complete isolation for 6 weeks. "We need to talk," she said. Something in her tone must have warned him because his whole body went rigid. "About what?" "About the fact that you have cancer and you've been hiding it from me." The color drained from Robert's face so quickly that Denise thought he might faint. He gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles going white. How did you?" He stopped, closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were filled with tears. "Oh God, Denise. I'm so sorry." She crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, taking his hands in hers. They were ice cold and shaking. "Tell me everything. From the beginning." For a moment she thought he was going to deny it, to try to maintain the lie that was clearly destroying him. But then his shoulders sagged and 8 weeks of carefully controlled fear came pouring out. "It started with the night sweats," he whispered. "About 2 months ago. I thought it was stress from the new school year, but they kept getting worse. Then I found a lump in my neck and I tried to ignore it, but Camille's divorce papers mention how her ex-husband ignored symptoms and—" He stopped, shaking his head. "That doesn't matter. I went to my doctor 6 weeks ago." Denise's chest tightened. 6 weeks. He'd been dealing with this for 6 weeks while she'd been worried about him coming home late and deleting text messages. "The tests took forever," he continued, his voice barely audible. "Blood work, scans, a biopsy. Every day I came home and looked at you and Grace and I thought, what if this is the last normal day we have? What if I'm about to destroy our whole world? Robert." And then I got the diagnosis. Stage 2 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. The doctor said it's treatable, that the survival rates are good, but all I could hear was the word, cancer. All I could think about was my father. Robert's father had died of lung cancer when Robert was Grace's age. Denise remembered the stories he'd told her about watching his dad waste away, about how the treatments had seemed worse than the disease, about how his mother had become a shell of herself trying to care for everyone. "I couldn't do that to you," he said, tears flowing freely now. "I couldn't watch you become my mother, exhausted and terrified and trying to hold everything together while I fell apart. And Grace. God, Denise, what if I put her through what I went through? What if I die and leave her with those memories?" Denise pulled him into her arms, feeling his whole body shake with suppressed sobs. "You should have told me. We're married, Robert. We're supposed to face things together." "I was going to," he said against her shoulder. "I've been trying to figure out how. Dr. Martinez, she's my social worker, she's been helping me plan what to say. We were going to tell you this weekend. I just wanted to have all the information first, to be able to answer your questions, to have a treatment plan so you'd know I was going to fight this thing." She pulled back to look at him, seeing her husband clearly for the first time in weeks. The weight loss wasn't from stress eating, it was from the cancer. The late nights weren't suspicious behavior, he'd been researching treatments and talking to other patients online. The password on his phone wasn't hiding an affair, it was protecting her from seeing his medical messages and search history. "What's the treatment plan?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 6 months of chemotherapy starting Monday. The oncologist thinks we caught it early enough that chemo alone should be sufficient, but—" He swallowed hard. "There's a chance I might need radiation later. And there are side effects. Hair loss, fatigue, nausea. I'm going to look sick, Denise. I'm going to feel sick. And I don't want Grace to see me like that. Grace is stronger than you think. And so am I." Robert shook his head. "You don't understand. The chemo is every other week for 6 months. I'll need someone to drive me because of the anti-nausea medication. I'll probably be too tired to cook or clean or help with homework. I might not be able to work full-time. Our insurance covers most of it, but there are co-pays and deductibles, and if I have to take extended leave." Denise could see the spiral of worry that had been consuming him, the way fear had multiplied into 1,000 practical concerns that he'd been trying to solve alone. "We'll figure it out," she said firmly. "All of it. Together. That's what marriage is, Robert. It's not just the good times. It's this too. But what if—" "No." She cupped his face in her hands, making him look directly at her. "No what ifs. We deal with what is. You have cancer. It's treatable. You start treatment on Monday. I'm going to drive you and I'm going to hold your hand and we're going to beat this thing together. Okay?" For the first time in weeks, Robert's smile looked real. "Okay." They sat together in the quiet basement office, holding each other while the weight of secrets finally lifted from Robert's shoulders. There would be difficult conversations ahead. They still had to tell Grace, to call Robert's mother and Denise's sister, to rearrange their lives around treatment schedules and side effects. But tonight, they were just a husband and wife who loved each other, facing the unknown together the way they'd promised to do 8 years ago. "Denise," Robert said quietly, "how did you find out?" "I was so careful." She thought about the cameras, about the hours she'd spent watching him through a screen instead of simply asking him what was wrong. The guilt she'd been carrying for 3 days pressed against her chest like a physical weight. "I saw the medical papers in the kitchen drawer," she said, which was true if not the whole truth. "And I called your school looking for you on Tuesday. They said you'd called in sick." Robert nodded, accepting this explanation. "I had an appointment with Dr. Martinez that day. We were discussing family disclosure strategies." Family disclosure strategies. While she'd been convinced he was having an affair, He'd been meeting with a social worker to figure out how to tell his wife and daughter that he might be dying. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you," she whispered. "I'm sorry I didn't trust you," he whispered back. They would both carry those apologies forward, using them to build something stronger than what they'd had before. Because sometimes love meant protecting each other from hard truths, and sometimes it meant facing those truths together. The trick was knowing the difference. On Monday, Denise would sit in a chemo clinic holding Robert's hand while poison dripped into his veins to kill the cancer trying to steal her husband. It would be the beginning of the hardest 6 months of their lives. But it would also be the beginning of the strongest their marriage had ever been. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of autumn sunshine that made everything look deceptively peaceful. Grace was at the kitchen table working on a jigsaw puzzle, her tongue poking out in concentration as she tried to fit a piece of bright blue sky into place. Robert was making pancakes, his Saturday tradition, but his movements were slower than usual, more deliberate. Denise watched him from the doorway, seeing everything differently now. The way he kept glancing at Grace like he was memorizing her profile. The way his hand shook slightly as he flipped a pancake. The way he'd made extra, as if this might be their last normal Saturday morning breakfast. "Daddy, this piece is broken," Grace announced, holding up a puzzle piece with a bent edge. "Let me see, baby girl." Robert wiped his hands on a dish towel and examined the piece. "It's not broken, just a little worn. Sometimes the best pieces look a little different, but they still fit perfectly where they belong." Denise's throat tightened. Everything felt heavy with meaning today, even innocent conversations about puzzle pieces. They decided to tell Grace after breakfast, before she made plans with her friends or settled into her usual Saturday routine of art projects and cartoons. Dr. Martinez had recommended honesty appropriate for her age level. Explain the illness, the treatment, and the fact that Daddy would be getting medicine to make him better, but that the medicine might make him tired and sick for a while. Keep it simple, Dr. Martinez had said during their family consultation call on Friday night. Children Grace's age can handle more truth than parents think, but they need concrete information and lots of reassurance about their own security. Grace had listened to the phone conversation from the stairs. Denise had caught her shadow in the hallway, but she'd been too far away to hear details. She'd been quieter than usual since then, watching her parents with the sharp intuition that 8-year-olds possessed when adults were trying to hide something. After breakfast, Robert cleared his throat in the careful way that meant he had something important to say. Grace looked up from her orange juice, immediately alert. "Grace, your mom and I need to talk to you about something," Robert began. "It's nothing you did wrong and you don't need to be scared, but it is something important." Grace set down her glass with the exaggerated care of a child who sensed the adults needed her to be very good right now. "Okay, Daddy." Robert looked at Denise and she nodded encouragingly. They'd practiced this conversation, but now that the moment was here, all their careful words felt inadequate. "You know how sometimes people get sick and they have to take medicine to get better?" Robert asked. Grace nodded solemnly. "Like when I had strep throat and had to take the pink medicine." "Exactly like that." "Well, Daddy has gotten sick with something called cancer. It's not like strep throat, it's more serious, but the doctors have medicine that can make me better. The medicine is called chemotherapy." Grace's eyes went wide. At 8 years old, she'd heard the word cancer before, probably at school or on TV, and she knew it was something serious. "Are you going to die?" The question hit like a physical blow. Robert's carefully prepared explanation crumbled, and for a moment he just stared at his daughter's worried face. "No, baby girl," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "The doctors say the medicine should make me all better. But while I'm taking it, I'm going to be very tired and I might feel sick sometimes. I might lose my hair and I'll have to go to the hospital a lot for treatments." "Will it hurt?" Grace asked, and Denise could see tears gathering in her daughter's eyes. "Sometimes," Robert said honestly. "But the doctors will give me medicine for the hurt too. And Mommy will be with me and you'll be with me and we're all going to take care of each other." Grace was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the seriousness of a child who understood that her world was changing. Then she asked the question that broke both her parents' hearts. "Is it because I wished for a baby brother last year? Did I make you sick?" "Oh, sweetheart, no." Robert pulled Grace into his lap, holding her close. "This has nothing to do with anything you wished for or said or did. Sometimes people just get sick and nobody knows why. It's not your fault, it's not Mommy's fault, and it's not my fault. It's just something that happened." "But you're going to get better?" Grace pressed, needing the reassurance repeated. "I'm going to fight very hard to get better," Robert promised. "And I have the best doctors and the best family, and that's going to help me be strong." Grace was quiet again, thinking. Then she wiggled out of Robert's lap and ran upstairs. Denise and Robert looked at each other, wondering if they'd handled it wrong, if they should follow her. Grace returned a few minutes later carrying her favorite stuffed animal, a worn teddy bear named Dr. Buttons that she'd gotten for her 5th birthday. She climbed back into Robert's lap and pressed the bear into his hands. "Dr. Buttons helped me feel better when I was scared about starting 2nd grade, she said seriously. "You can borrow him while you're getting better. He's very good at making people not scared." Robert's composure finally cracked. He buried his face in Grace's hair, his shoulders shaking as he cried silent tears of gratitude and heartbreak. Their 8-year-old daughter was trying to comfort him with her most precious possession. "Thank you, baby girl," he whispered. "Dr. Buttons is going to help me a lot." They spent the rest of the morning answering Grace's questions, which ranged from practical, "Will you still be able to drive me to school?" to philosophical, "Do sick people have different dreams?" to heartbreakingly innocent, "Can I come to the hospital with you so you're not lonely?" By lunchtime, Grace seemed to have processed the information as well as any 8-year-old could. She was still quieter than usual, but she'd started talking about ways she could help, bringing Robert water when he felt sick, reading him stories when he was tired, and letting him pick the movie for family movie night, because sick people should get to choose. That afternoon, while Grace was playing in the backyard, Denise found Robert sitting on their bed, holding Dr. Buttons and staring out the window. "She's going to be okay," Denise said, sitting beside him. "She's 8 years old, Denise. She shouldn't have to worry about whether her father is going to live or die. She's not just any 8-year-old. She's our 8-year-old. She's got your strength and my stubbornness, and she's going to be exactly what you need her to be." Robert nodded, but his grip on the stuffed bear tightened. "What if the treatment doesn't work? What if—" "Then we'll deal with that when we come to it," Denise said firmly. "But today, right now, we have a daughter who knows the truth and still loves us. We have a treatment plan that starts Monday. We have each other. That's enough for today." That night, Grace insisted on sleeping in their bed, curled up between her parents like she used to do during thunderstorms when she was smaller. As she drifted off to sleep, she mumbled something about making sure Daddy didn't have bad dreams. Denise lay awake long after Robert and Grace had fallen asleep, listening to the sound of her family breathing in the darkness. On Monday their real fight would begin. There would be hospitals and side effects, good days and bad days, hope and fear in equal measure. But tonight they were all together and they all knew the truth, and somehow that felt like victory already. The cameras she'd hidden earlier that week were long gone, but she didn't need them anymore to see what mattered. Her husband was brave and terrified and human. Her daughter was resilient and loving and wise beyond her years. Her family was facing the unknown together. And that was enough. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, as if the weather understood the gravity of the day. Denise had taken the week off from work, telling her supervisor only that there was a family medical situation that required her immediate attention. Robert had submitted his extended medical leave paperwork on Friday, and his substitute teacher would start today. They dropped Grace off at school first, both of them hugging her a little longer than usual. She'd packed an extra granola bar in Robert's lunch bag with a note that read, "For when the medicine makes you hungry," in her careful 2nd grade handwriting. The cancer center at Chicago General Hospital was nothing like Denise had imagined. Instead of the stark, depressing medical facility she'd pictured, it was warm and welcoming with soft lighting and comfortable furniture. Volunteers offered coffee and magazines, and the staff moved with the kind of gentle efficiency that suggested they understood they were dealing with people on the worst days of their lives. Dr. Sarah Martinez met them in the lobby, the same woman Denise had seen on the security footage but now could appreciate as the lifeline she'd been for Robert during his weeks of secrecy. "How are we feeling today?" Dr. Martinez asked, though her question was clearly directed at both of them. "Nervous," Robert admitted. "But ready. That's completely normal. Denise, I'm so glad you're here. Robert's been worried about how to include you in his care team." Denise took Robert's hand, feeling the slight tremor in his fingers. "I'm not going anywhere." The chemo suite was a large, open room filled with comfortable recliners, each with its own 4-pole and privacy curtain. Patients in various stages of treatment read books, dozed, or talked quietly with family members. The atmosphere was peaceful, almost meditative, despite the serious medical procedures taking place. Robert's nurse, a woman named Linda with kind eyes and steady hands, explained the process as she prepared his for. The treatment would take about 4 hours, first anti-nausea medication, then the chemotherapy drugs, then more anti-nausea medicine and fluids to help his body process everything. "The first treatment is often the easiest," Linda explained as she found a vein in Robert's arm. Your body hasn't built up a cumulative reaction yet. Some people feel fine for the first few days, then experience fatigue and nausea. Others feel effects right away. Everyone's different. Denise settled into the chair beside Robert's recliner, her laptop bag filled with work she probably wouldn't be able to concentrate on. Robert had brought a stack of books and his tablet loaded with movies, but for now they just sat quietly, holding hands as the first bag of medicine dripped slowly into his bloodstream. I keep thinking I should feel different, Robert said after about an hour. Like I should be able to feel the poison fighting the cancer. The drugs are working even if you can't feel them, Linda assured him, checking his vitals. Sometimes the best medicine is the kind you don't notice. Around noon, Camille appeared in the doorway of the chemo suite, still wearing her nursing scrubs from her shift at Children's Hospital. Denise looked up in surprise. What are you doing here? Robert called me yesterday, Camille said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Asked if I could come sit with you guys for a while. I hope that's okay. Denise felt a rush of gratitude so strong it nearly knocked her over. In the chaos of Robert's diagnosis and treatment planning, she'd been so focused on being strong for her husband that she'd forgotten she might need support too. It's more than okay, she said, hugging her best friend tightly. Camille had brought lunch from their favorite deli, and the three of them spent the next 2 hours talking about everything except cancer. Camille shared gossip from the hospital, Robert told stories about his students, and Denise found herself laughing for the first time in days. You know what's funny? Robert said as Linda prepared to start his second bag of medication. I spent 6 weeks terrified to tell anyone about this, convinced that saying it out loud would make it more real. But sitting here with you two, it feels less scary somehow. Like I'm not fighting this alone anymore. You were never fighting it alone, Denise said. You just couldn't see your army yet. The afternoon passed more quickly than expected. Robert dozed intermittently, and when he was awake he seemed more relaxed than he'd been in weeks. The secret that had been eating him alive was gone, replaced by a concrete plan and people who loved him. As Linda removed his around 4 p.m., she handed them a packet of information about what to expect over the next few days. Remember, everyone reacts differently, she said. Some people go home and feel fine for days. Others feel tired right away. Call if you have a fever over 100.4, severe nausea that prevents you from keeping fluids down, or any other symptoms that worry you. We have medications for almost everything, so don't try to tough it out. The drive home was quiet, with Robert dozing in the passenger seat and Denise trying not to analyze every expression that crossed his face. Grace was waiting for them at the kitchen window, and she ran outside before they'd even finished parking. How do you feel, Daddy? Are you better now? Robert smiled and scooped her up, though Denise noticed the hug was briefer than usual. The medicine is working on making me better, but it takes time. How was school? Grace launched into a detailed account of her day, seemingly reassured that her father was still himself despite having spent the day in a hospital. They ordered pizza for dinner, and Robert managed to eat a full slice, though he pushed the rest around his plate without much enthusiasm. That evening, as they got Grace ready for bed, Robert seemed more tired than usual but otherwise normal. He read her 2 chapters of their current book, did voices for all the characters, and kissed her goodnight just like always. See? Grace said to Denise as they tucked her in. Daddy's still Daddy. The medicine didn't change him. But Denise could see the subtle differences. The way Robert moved a little more slowly. The way he sat down heavily as if his bones were suddenly denser. The way he kept pressing his hand to his stomach, testing for nausea that hadn't arrived yet but might. They went to bed early, both exhausted by the emotional weight of the day. As they lay in the darkness, Robert reached for her hand. Thank you, he said quietly. For what? For not making me go through that alone. For driving me there and sitting with me and making it feel like just another day instead of the beginning of the end. It's not the beginning of the end, Denise said firmly. It's the beginning of getting better. Robert squeezed her hand. I love you. I love you too. At 3 a.m., Denise woke to the sound of Robert retching in the bathroom. So it begins, she thought, as she got up to wet a washcloth and help her husband through his first real encounter with the side effects of fighting for his life. It would be a long 6 months. But they would face every one of those days together just like this one. And that was everything. By Thursday, Robert could barely keep his eyes open. The fatigue wasn't like being tired after a long day, it was a bone-deep exhaustion that made even simple tasks feel impossible. He'd managed to shower that morning, but afterward he'd needed to lie down for an hour just to recover from the effort. Denise worked from home, setting up her laptop at the kitchen table so she could be nearby when Robert needed anything. Grace had adapted to their new routine with the flexibility of childhood, bringing her homework to the living room so she could do it near Robert's spot on the couch. "Daddy, want to see my math worksheet?" Grace asked, bouncing slightly as she held up a paper covered in addition problems. Robert opened his eyes and managed a smile. "Show me, baby girl." Grace climbed carefully onto the couch beside him, mindful of the way he'd been moving slowly all week. "Mrs. Peterson said I got them all right. And look," she pointed to a star sticker at the top of the page. "She said my handwriting is getting much better." "That's my smart girl," Robert said, his voice hoarse with fatigue. "I'm so proud of you." Denise watched this interaction from the kitchen, her heart breaking and healing simultaneously. Robert was sicker than he'd been willing to admit, but he was still Grace's father. Still the man who celebrated her small victories and made her feel like the most important person in the world. The nausea had started on Tuesday night and had been relentless ever since. Robert had lost 8 pounds in 4 days, and Denise had called the cancer center twice, worried that something was seriously wrong. Both times, Linda had assured her that this was within the range of normal reactions, and they'd adjusted his anti-nausea medications. "Some people sail through chemo," Linda had explained during their Wednesday phone call. "Others have a harder time. Robert's body is working hard to process some pretty strong medicine. This doesn't mean the treatment isn't working, it often means it's working very well." But knowing it was normal didn't make it easier to watch. Robert, who had always been strong and capable, could barely lift his head off the pillow some days. The man who made pancakes every Saturday morning now felt nauseated at the smell of coffee. The father who used to chase Grace around the backyard was too weak to walk to the mailbox. Friday afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Denise answered the doorbell to find Beverly Patterson, Robert's mother, standing on their front porch with a suitcase and a determined expression. "Beverly," Denise said, surprised. "I thought you weren't coming until next week." "I changed my flight," the older woman said, stepping into the house and looking around with the sharp eyes of someone assessing a situation. "Robert sounded terrible when I called him yesterday, and you sounded like you were trying to do everything yourself." Beverly Patterson was 62 years old, recently retired from 30 years as a head librarian, and had never been known to sugarcoat anything. She'd raised Robert as a single mother after his father's death, and she approached problems with the practical efficiency of someone who'd learned to handle crises alone. "Where is he?" she asked. "On the couch. Grace is doing homework with him." Beverly walked into the living room and stopped short when she saw her son. Robert was pale and thin, his skin taking on the grayish tint that came with severe nausea. He was wearing the same pajamas he'd had on for 2 days, and his hair was starting to fall out in patches. "Hi, Mom," he said weakly, trying to sit up straighter. "Don't you dare try to pretend you're fine," Beverly said briskly, but her voice was gentle as she leaned down to kiss his forehead. "You look terrible." "Thanks, Mom. You always know just what to say." "I know what I see. And what I see is a man who needs taking care of, and a wife who's trying to be everything to everyone." She looked at Grace, who was watching this exchange with wide eyes. "And a granddaughter who's being very brave but probably needs some extra attention too." Beverly was right, Denise realized. In her focus on Robert's immediate needs, she'd been trying to maintain normalcy for Grace while managing her own fear and exhaustion. She'd been living on coffee and adrenaline for 5 days, sleeping in snatches and snapping at people over small things. "I can help," Beverly announced. "I raised a son through cancer treatment once before, unfortunately. I know what we're dealing with." For the first time since Monday, Denise felt like she could breathe fully. Having another adult in the house, especially one who understood the long view of cancer treatment, felt like receiving a life preserver she hadn't realized she was drowning without. That evening, Beverly took charge of dinner, making something simple that Robert might be able to tolerate. She helped Grace with her homework while Denise caught up on work emails she'd been neglecting. Most importantly, she gave Denise permission to step away from constant vigilance for a few hours. "Go take a shower," Beverly instructed. "A real shower, not the 5-minute rinse you've been getting. Wash your hair. Put on clean clothes. You can't take care of him if you don't take care of yourself." The hot water felt like luxury Denise had forgotten existed. When she emerged from the bathroom 40 minutes later, she found Beverly reading to both Robert and Grace from one of Grace's chapter books, her voice filling the living room with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who isn't afraid of what they're facing. That night, for the first time since treatment started, Denise slept for 6 straight hours. She woke up refreshed enough to realize how close to her breaking point she'd been. Over the weekend, a routine emerged. Beverly handled morning medications and the gentle coaxing required to get Robert to eat something, anything. Denise managed the medical calls and appointment scheduling. Grace helped by being herself, bringing her father water without being asked, sharing her drawings, and providing the kind of uncomplicated love that couldn't be manufactured or prescribed. On Sunday afternoon, Robert had his first really good hour since Thursday. The nausea receded enough for him to sit up and eat a few spoonfuls of soup, and he was alert enough to help Grace with a school project about family trees. "Tell me about great-grandpa again," Grace asked, working carefully with colored pencils to draw the branches of their family. "He was a teacher too," Robert said, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "He taught high school history in Mississippi, back when that was a very brave thing for a black man to do." "Was he brave like you, Daddy?" Robert looked confused. "I'm not brave, baby girl. I'm just sick." "But you're fighting the sickness," Grace said matter-of-factly. "That's brave. And you're still being my daddy even when you don't feel good. That's brave too." Denise caught Beverly's eye across the room, and saw her own thoughts reflected there. Children saw things so clearly sometimes. They saw courage in getting up each day, love in small gestures, and hope in the simple act of continuing to exist. Robert's good hour faded by evening, and Monday would bring another treatment, another cycle of drugs and side effects and the long work of healing. But Sunday had given them something precious, proof that the man they loved was still there, underneath the fatigue and nausea and fear. He was fighting one day at a time. And so were they. By the third week of November, Robert had settled into a rhythm with the treatments. 3 weeks on, 1 week off. The off weeks were becoming precious islands of relative normalcy, while the treatment weeks required all their combined strength to navigate. Denise had learned to read the signs, the subtle pallor that meant nausea was coming, the way Robert's shoulders hunched when he was trying to hide how weak he felt, the particular stillness that meant he was conserving energy for whatever came next. Grace had adapted too, in the way children do when their world shifts. She'd learned to be quieter during Robert's bad days, to bring him water without being asked, and to save her more energetic stories for when he felt better. She'd also started drawing pictures of their family that always included Dr. Buttons, the teddy bear that had become Robert's constant companion during treatments. But it was Robert himself who surprised them all. "I want to go to Grace's school play," he announced on a Thursday evening in late November. He was between treatments, feeling better than he had in weeks, though his hair was completely gone now and he'd lost nearly 15 pounds. "Honey, the play is on a treatment day," Denise said gently. "You'll just have finished chemo that afternoon." "I know. But it's Grace's first solo. She's been practicing for weeks. I'm not missing it." Grace looked up from her dinner, hope blazing in her eyes. The school's holiday performance was the biggest event of her year, and she'd been chosen to sing a verse of Silent Night by herself. She'd been practicing in her room every evening, her 8-year-old voice growing more confident each day. "Are you sure?" Denise asked. "You could barely sit up for an hour last week after treatment. Linda said I could take extra anti-nausea medication that day. And Beverly will be here to help. I'm going to that play even if you have to wheel me there in a hospital bed." Beverly, who had extended her visit indefinitely, nodded approvingly. "Good. That little girl needs to see her father in the audience cheering for her. We'll figure out the logistics." The night of the play, Robert was pale and exhausted from his afternoon treatment, but he was dressed in his best sweater and sitting in the third row of Hawthorne Elementary's multipurpose room. Beverly sat on one side of him, Denise on the other, and they all held their breath as Grace walked to the front of the stage. She looked tiny under the bright lights, wearing the white dress they'd bought specially for the occasion. For a moment she scanned the audience, her eyes searching. When she spotted Robert, her face lit up with pure joy, and she waved so enthusiastically that several parents chuckled. Then she began to sing. Her voice was clear and sweet, carrying the simple melody with 8-year-old earnestness. But it was the way she sang directly to Robert, as if the song was meant for him alone, that made every adult in the room understand they were witnessing something special. "Silent night, holy night, all is calm, all is bright." Robert cried through the entire song, tears streaming down his face while Grace smiled at him from the stage. When she finished, the applause was thunderous, but Grace only had eyes for her father's proud face in the third row. "She did that for you," Beverly whispered to Robert. "That little girl sang her heart out because she knew you were here." After the play, Grace ran straight to Robert, still wearing her white dress and glowing with the satisfaction of a performance well done. "Did you hear me, Daddy? Did I do good?" "You were perfect, baby girl," Robert said, pulling her into a careful hug. "Absolutely perfect." That night, as they drove home, Grace chattering excitedly about the play and her friends' performances, Denise realized something had shifted. Robert had made a choice to prioritize being Grace's father over protecting himself from discomfort. He'd chosen to show up for her life, even when showing up was hard. "How do you feel?" she asked him quietly while Grace talked to Beverly in the back seat. "Tired. Nauseated. But also..." He paused, searching for words. "Proud. Happy. Like myself again, if that makes sense." It made perfect sense. For weeks, Robert had been defined by his illness, by what he couldn't do, by how the cancer and treatment were limiting his life. Tonight, he'd been Grace's father first and a cancer patient second. The shift continued over the following weeks. Robert started joining their dinner conversations more actively, even when he couldn't eat much. He insisted on helping Grace with homework, even if he had to lie down afterward. He began talking about plans for after treatment ended: Grace's birthday party in the spring, the family vacation they'd put on hold, the garden he wanted to plant in their backyard. "The doctors say I'm responding well to treatment," he told Denise after his appointment in early December. "The tumors are shrinking faster than they expected. Dr. Williams thinks we might be able to finish treatment earlier than planned." "Really?" The hope in Denise's voice was impossible to hide. "Really? I might be done by February instead of April. Which means I could be back to full-time teaching for the last quarter of the school year." That night, they made love for the first time since his diagnosis. It was gentle and slow, both of them acutely aware of Robert's fragility, but it was also a reclamation of themselves as a couple rather than just a patient and caregiver. "I missed this," Robert whispered afterward, holding Denise close. "I missed feeling like a husband instead of just someone who needed taking care of." "You're always my husband," Denise replied. "Sick or well, you're always my husband." December brought small victories that felt enormous. Robert managed to stay awake for an entire family movie night. He helped Grace build a gingerbread house without needing to rest halfway through. He even cooked breakfast one Saturday morning, just scrambled eggs and toast, but the first meal he'd prepared since treatment started. On Christmas morning, Grace found a special present under the tree, a scrapbook Robert had been secretly working on during his better moments. It was filled with photos from their life together: Grace's baby pictures, family vacations, everyday moments he'd captured when no one was looking. On the last page he'd written, "For Grace, who taught me that love is the strongest medicine of all." Grace hugged the book to her chest and announced, "This is the best Christmas ever because Daddy's getting better." And he was. Slowly, day by day, treatment by treatment, Robert was winning his fight against cancer. More importantly, their family was emerging stronger than before, bonded by the shared experience of facing the unthinkable and discovering they could survive it together. The cameras Denise had installed in those first fearful days seemed like artifacts from another life. She'd been so afraid of losing Robert to something imaginary that she'd almost missed the real threat trying to take him away. But they'd faced it together in the end, and that had made all the difference. As they cleaned up wrapping paper that Christmas morning, Beverly announced she'd be staying through New Year's. "I want to be here when you ring the bell," she said. The bell was a tradition at the cancer center. Patients rang it on their last day of treatment, marking the end of their journey. Robert's bell ringing was still 6 weeks away, but already they could see it on the horizon, the finish line of the hardest race they'd ever run. And they were going to cross it together. February 14th, 2025. Valentine's Day. "How's that for romantic?" Robert joked as Linda prepared his for the last time. "Most guys give their wives flowers. I'm giving you the gift of finishing chemotherapy." Denise laughed, though her eyes were bright with tears. After 5 months and 12 treatments, this was it. The final bag of medicine that would hopefully complete Robert's healing. The cancer center had become familiar territory over the winter months. They knew Linda's schedule, the best parking spots, which vending machines had the snacks that Robert could tolerate. They'd watched other patients come and go, celebrating bell ringings and occasionally mourning setbacks. Today it was their turn for celebration. Grace was at school, but she'd made Robert a card that morning that read, "Happy last chemo day, Daddy," in her careful third-grade handwriting. Inside, she'd drawn a picture of their family under a rainbow, with Robert standing tall and strong, his hair magically grown back in brown crayon curls. "She's been counting down the days on her calendar," Denise told Linda as the nurse checked Robert's vitals. "She's more excited about this than her birthday." "That's how it should be," Linda said warmly. "This is a birthday of sorts, the beginning of the rest of your lives." Robert looked better than he had in months. The treatments had taken their toll. He was still thin, still tired more easily than before, but there was color in his cheeks again and life in his eyes. Most remarkably, his hair had started growing back, a soft fuzz that Grace insisted on touching every morning for luck. Dr. Williams, Robert's oncologist, stopped by during the treatment to deliver the news they'd been hoping for. "Your latest scans look excellent," he said, settling into the chair beside Robert's recliner. "No sign of active cancer. The lymph nodes are normal size, and your blood work is better than we've seen since you started treatment." Denise felt her knees go weak with relief. They'd been optimistic based on how well Robert had been responding, but hearing the official confirmation felt like a miracle. "So I'm cured?" Robert asked. "We don't use that word right away," Dr. Williams explained gently. "We'll say you're in remission. We'll do scans every 3 months for the first year, then every 6 months after that. But based on what we're seeing, you have every reason to be very optimistic about your future." Remission. The word settled over them like a warm blanket. Not cured, not yet, but close enough to start planning for tomorrow again. As the final bag of chemotherapy dripped into Robert's system, they talked about the future in concrete terms for the first time in months. Robert would return to teaching in March, starting with half-days and building back to full-time. Grace's birthday party in April, they could plan something big now, invite all her friends. The summer vacation they'd postponed, maybe they'd finally take that trip to Disney World that Grace had been requesting for 2 years. "I want to plant a garden," Robert said, watching the last of the medicine disappear from the 4-bag. "I want to grow things. I want to watch things come back to life." Camille arrived just as Linda was removing Robert's 4 for the final time, bringing a bouquet of daffodils and a bottle of sparkling cider for the celebration. "You did it," she said, hugging them both. "You beat cancer." "We did it," Robert corrected. "All of us together." At 3:30 p.m., Linda handed Robert a small brass bell, worn smooth by the hands of countless patients who had reached this same milestone. "Ring it loud," she said. "Let everyone know you're done." Robert stood up slowly, still weak from the treatment but steady on his feet. Denise and Camille flanked him as he walked to the bell mounted on the wall near the nurse's station. Other patients and their families gathered around, understanding the significance of the moment. Robert raised the bell, paused for a moment to look at his wife and best friend, and then rang it with all the strength he had. The sound echoed through the cancer center, clear and bright and final. Applause broke out from the other patients, and Linda wiped away tears as she hugged Robert goodbye. "I don't want to see you back here," she said, "except for visits to tell us how wonderful your life is." They picked up Grace from school together, the 3 of them walking hand in hand to the car. Grace had been practically vibrating with excitement all day, and when she saw them, she knew immediately that something momentous had happened. "Did you ring the bell, Daddy? Are you all better now?" "I rang the bell," Robert confirmed. "And I'm going to keep getting better every day." That evening, Beverly cooked a celebration dinner, Robert's favorite meal of fried chicken and mac and cheese, foods he hadn't been able to tolerate in months. He managed to eat a full plate, his appetite finally returning along with his strength. As they sat around the dinner table, sharing stories and laughter, Denise thought about how far they'd traveled from that night in October when she'd installed cameras to spy on her husband. She'd been so afraid of losing him to something imaginary that she'd almost missed the real threat. But cancer had taught them things that no marriage book could. They'd learned that love wasn't just about the good times, it was about holding each other through the impossible days. They'd discovered that Grace was stronger and more resilient than they'd given her credit for. They'd found out that asking for help wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. "I have something to tell you both," Robert said as they finished dessert. He looked nervous, the way he had all those months ago when he'd been keeping secrets. Denise's heart skipped, but Robert's smile reassured her that this was a good secret. "I've been working on something during treatment. Something I couldn't tell you about because I wanted it to be a surprise." He pulled out his phone and showed them a document. "I've been accepted to graduate school. The University of Chicago's education program. I'm going to get my master's degree and become a principal." "Robert," Denise exclaimed. "When did you apply? How did you even have time?" "During those long chemo sessions," he admitted. "I had hours to sit and think about what I wanted my life to look like after cancer. I realized I want to make a bigger difference in kids' lives. I want to run a school, create programs, really change things." Grace bounced in her chair. "Does that mean you'll be the boss of all the teachers?" "Something like that," Robert laughed. "It means I'll get to help make schools better for kids like you." They spent the rest of the evening planning this new future. Robert would start classes in the fall, taking them slowly while he continued teaching. It would mean busy schedules and careful time management, but after surviving cancer treatment, graduate school felt manageable. That night, as they tucked Grace into bed, she asked the question that had been weighing on her mind all day. "Daddy, is the cancer really gone forever?" Robert sat on the edge of her bed, choosing his words carefully. The doctors say it's gone for now, and that's very good news. But I'll have to go for checkups to make sure it stays gone. The important thing is that we don't have to be scared anymore. We can make plans and dream about the future. Good, Grace said decisively. Because I have lots of plans. Like when I'm in 4th grade, you can be the principal of my school. And when I'm in college, you can help me with my homework because you'll be really smart from graduate school. Those sound like excellent plans, Robert agreed, kissing her forehead. I can't wait to see them all come true. As they turned off Grace's light and headed to their own bedroom, Denise reflected on how much had changed since February began. Then Robert had been fighting for his life. Now he was planning the rest of it. The man she'd fallen in love with 13 years ago was still there, maybe thinner, definitely balder, certainly more aware of life's fragility, but unmistakably himself. The cameras she'd hidden in fear and suspicion had captured a man protecting his family from terrible news. Tonight, she was lying beside a man who had fought cancer and won, who was dreaming about the future again, who was ready to take on new challenges and adventures. I love you, she whispered in the darkness. I love you too, he whispered back. Thank you for fighting with me. Thank you for letting me. Outside their bedroom window, the first snow of the year was beginning to fall, covering their neighborhood in clean white possibility. Tomorrow would bring the first day of the rest of their lives, a life without cancer treatments, without fear, without secrets. A life full of everything they'd almost lost and everything they'd fought to keep. 6 months later, on a bright Saturday morning in August, Denise stood in their backyard watching Robert teach Grace how to tend the tomato plants they'd grown from seeds. His hair had grown back thick and curly, and he'd gained back most of the weight he'd lost during treatment. More importantly, he moved with the easy confidence of someone who trusted his body again. See how the leaves are turning yellow down here? He was explaining to Grace, who was listening with the intense focus she brought to everything her father taught her. That means the plant is putting all its energy into making the tomatoes ripen. Grace nodded seriously, making notes in the gardening journal Robert had bought her. So it's like when I get really tired after running because my body worked hard? Exactly like that. Plants and people aren't so different, we both need the right conditions to grow strong. Denise smiled, remembering Robert's words from treatment. I want to plant a garden. I want to grow things. I want to watch things come back to life. The garden had become his favorite project, a visible symbol of growth and renewal that he tended with the same careful attention he'd once reserved for lesson plans. Their tomatoes were prize-worthy now, the plants heavy with fruit in various stages of ripening. Grace had learned to identify when each variety was ready to pick, and she took her responsibilities as assistant gardener very seriously. Mom, come see. Grace called. We've got enough for salad tonight, plus extra for Mrs. Rodriguez next door. Mrs. Rodriguez was their elderly neighbor whose own garden had struggled this year. Grace had appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood produce distributor, showing up at doors with baskets of vegetables and bright smiles. As Denise joined them among the tomato plants, she thought about how far they'd all come since that terrible night in October when she'd installed cameras out of fear and suspicion. Grace had grown 3 inches and gained confidence that came from learning she could handle difficult things. Robert had not only beaten cancer but discovered new dreams for his future. And Denise, she'd learned the difference between surveillance and support, between watching someone and truly seeing them. I got my test results back yesterday, Robert said quietly, while Grace was distracted by a butterfly that had landed on the marigolds. His quarterly scans had become routine, but Denise still held her breath every time until they got the all clear. And? Still clean. Dr. Williams says if the next 2 scans are clear, we can move to annual checkups. The relief never got easier even after 6 months of good news. Each clean scan was a gift, a promise of more time, more Saturday mornings in the garden, more ordinary moments that had once seemed impossible to guarantee. Daddy, Mrs. Patterson is here, Grace announced, spotting Beverly's car in the driveway. Beverly had returned to her own life in Detroit after Robert finished treatment, but she visited every few weeks, claiming she needed to check on her son's recovery. Really, Denise suspected, she just missed being part of their daily lives after the intensity of the treatment months. Perfect timing, Robert said, gathering the ripe tomatoes into a basket. I wanted to show her the corn. The corn was Robert's pride and joy, 8-foot stalks that promised a harvest in another few weeks. He'd researched heirloom varieties and soil amendments with the thoroughness he'd once applied to chemotherapy protocols, channeling his need to control something into nurturing growth instead of fighting disease. Beverly appeared in the backyard carrying a covered dish and wearing the expression of someone who had news to share. Well, she announced without preamble, "I've decided to move to Chicago." The reaction was immediate and enthusiastic. Grace cheered and ran to hug her grandmother. Robert looked shocked but pleased. Denise felt a rush of gratitude. Beverly had become family in the truest sense during Robert's treatment, and having her nearby would be a blessing for all of them. "Are you serious?" Robert asked. "Dead serious. I found a lovely apartment about 20 minutes from here. 2 bedrooms so Grace can have sleepovers whenever she wants. Close enough to help but far enough away that I won't be in your business every day. But what about Detroit? Your friends, your house?" Beverly waved a hand dismissively. "My friends will visit. The house will sell. At my age, I've learned that family is more important than geography. Besides," she added with a smile, "someone needs to help with that grandchild of mine, and I have a feeling you two might want to give her a sibling eventually." Denise and Robert exchanged a look. They had talked about expanding their family, carefully and tentatively, now that Robert's health was stable. The conversation was still theoretical, but it was a conversation they could have again, planning for the future instead of just surviving the present. "Plus," Beverly continued, "I've been volunteering at the cancer center. Linda introduced me to their patient family support program. Turns out there's quite a need for people who understand what families go through during treatment." Of course there was. Beverly had navigated cancer with her first husband, then again with Robert. She understood the particular fears and challenges that came with loving someone through treatment. Her practical wisdom and refusal to be intimidated by medical situations would be invaluable to other families starting their own fights. They spent the afternoon together, picking vegetables and planning Beverly's move. Grace appointed herself the official apartment decorator, full of ideas about where Beverly should put her furniture and which walls needed family photos. As evening approached, they moved inside for dinner, the kitchen filled with the easy conversation of people who'd been through something difficult together and come out stronger. Robert looked relaxed in a way that still sometimes surprised Denise, the constant tension of treatment and recovery finally replaced by simple contentment. "I have news too," Denise announced as they finished eating. "I got a promotion at work. They want me to head up the new cybersecurity awareness program. The position would mean traveling to schools and community centers, teaching people about digital privacy and online safety. It was work that felt meaningful in a way her previous job hadn't, protecting people instead of just protecting data." "That's wonderful," Robert said, reaching for her hand across the table. "You'll be amazing at that. It means I'll be away sometimes, overnight trips for training sessions." "I'll hold down the fort," Robert assured her. "Grace and I are pretty good partners these days." They were. Robert's treatment had forced him to slow down, to be more present in the daily routines of Grace's life. He discovered that he actually enjoyed the school pickup conversations and homework supervision that had once felt like chores. Grace, in turn, had become more independent and helpful, rising to meet the family's needs with 8-year-old determination. After Beverly left and Grace was in bed, Denise and Robert sat on their back porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The garden was a maze of shadows and shapes, but they could hear the rustle of growing things in the warm evening breeze. "Do you ever think about those cameras?" Robert asked suddenly. Denise was quiet for a moment. She did think about them more often than she'd ever admit. Not with guilt, exactly, but with recognition of how fear could twist love into something unrecognizable. "I think about them," she said finally. "I think about how scared I was, and how that fear almost made me miss what was really happening." "What was really happening?" "You were protecting us. The same way I thought I was protecting us by watching you. We were both so afraid of losing each other that we almost lost each other." Robert was quiet, processing this. "I should have told you from the beginning. And I should have asked instead of assumed the worst." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of shared experience settling between them like a familiar blanket. They'd learned things about each other during Robert's illness, about strength and weakness, about love and fear, about the difference between protecting someone and trusting them. "I'm glad you know everything now," Robert said. "I'm glad there are no more secrets." "No more secrets," Denise agreed. Above them, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring ordinary Sunday activities: church, grocery shopping, maybe a family bike ride if the weather held. Simple, precious normalcy that they'd fought to preserve and would never take for granted again. In the distance, they could hear Grace's voice from her bedroom window, talking to Dr. Buttons as she settled in for sleep. Their daughter was telling the stuffed bear about the day's garden adventures, her voice bright with happiness and security. "We did good," Robert said softly. "We did good," Denise agreed. And in the garden around them, the things they'd planted together continued to grow in the darkness, reaching toward tomorrow's light.